beyond just the anecdotal. So I'll put that plug in case any of you are looking for something to do in your spare time. I would urge you to become a disaster psychiatrist. I did my clinical psychology internship at Johns Hopkins many, many years ago. I went away to Harvard, was on the faculty, and then came back, and I was chief psychologist, director of behavioral medicine at one of the Johns Hopkins hospitals. The vice chairman for psychiatry at the time was a guy by the name of Mickey Kaminsky. And Dr. Kaminsky was, I've heard him described as the psychiatrist. An amazing mind, an amazing clinician. And one of his gifts was he knew what he knew and he knew what he didn't know. And he came to me one day and he said, I want to be a disaster psychiatrist. I don't know how. Teach me. And I said, fine. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of the sojourn, condensed in terms of background. We'll talk about a new heuristic, relatively new, that helps us get greater, I guess, insight into the psychological process through examining disaster phases, if you will. We'll take a look at a continuum of care, and then I'd like to spend some time talking about this thing, psychological first aid, what it is, what it isn't, how it compares to therapy, and again, the limited amount of research in this area. So this is my summer vacation. This is how I spend my summers. I've been to 39 countries, 6 continents, and usually I'm going when everybody else is leaving. Wars, radiation, famines, hurricanes, tsunamis, you name it. My first experience was 1979, and it's in your upper left-hand corner. 3 Mile Island was a fascinating place to learn. So there was a partial meltdown of the nuclear core in one of the reactors. Radiation escaped into the atmosphere. Now, the radiation was measured at roughly the same as you would get in a chest x-ray. So there was not expected to be physical casualties, physical fallout, although some data years later indicated there was a slight bump in cancer rates. But my role was taking a look at the psychological impact. So I went to 3 Mile Island, which is outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and did some interviews. And everybody was basically doing fine. At least that's what they said. So one of my colleagues also decided to draw blood, and he wanted to look at catecholamine levels. So while the people were telling me everything was fine, their catecholamine levels were spiking. So this is where you go back and you say, so can you help me understand the discrepancy here? So your catecholamine levels, your adrenaline levels tell us that you're under a lot of stress, yet you're telling me that you're okay. That was one of the best field introductions to the ego defense mechanism of denial I had seen in years. So they said, oh, okay. You know, when we look at those towers, when we see steam coming out of them, we don't know whether it's radioactive or not. And I said, well, what's the government saying? And they would pause and they'd say, you know, we're not sure we trust government. And that's not a commentary, other than the importance of crisis messaging, how important it is to get out in front, stay current. And 3 Mile Island was a textbook case of poor crisis messaging. My colleague found that the people that were most distressed were women who had children and women who were pregnant, and that made some sense. He went back 4 years later, drew blood again, and found that there were very little declinations in the catecholamine levels, suggesting again that something was going on. So, and I come with my interview, and people are still saying, we're looking at the steam coming out of there, and we're still not convinced it's not radioactive. So I think the first lesson to be learned is the importance of crisis messaging. I'll get into that a little bit more later because we have advanced that field. We actually have a formula on how to be most effective. Sadly, most public information officers do not follow it. Most politicians do not follow it. The first national call out for the American Red Cross Disaster Mental Health Initiative was Hurricane Andrew. It was summer of 1992. That correlates with my birthday of the field. Each state was asked by the American Red Cross to establish a disaster mental health contingent. I was responsible for creating that for the state of Maryland. My job was to recruit psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers to go out to be deployed. So our first national deployment was Hurricane Andrew. Let's say we could have done it better. We made two egregious errors. One, we assumed that if you had a license to practice mental health, that you knew how to go out in the field and apply that in the midst of a disaster. That is a terrible mistake. The other thing that we learned was the countertransference reactions. I would say only about half were prepared for what they saw. Now, this is important because Hurricane Andrew was not a gruesome hurricane. It did not leave bodies in the streets. It did leave devastation, 200-mile-an-hour winds. There aren't too many buildings that can stand up to that. But we literally had some people who volunteered to pay their own way back if they could cut their deployment short. So something's going on. If you look at the top row in the middle picture, this looks a little different. This is actually the New York Stock Exchange. And we asked the question, where can a disaster psychiatrist ply the trade? Well, some of the other pictures are probably self-evident. This one, perhaps less so. So when the markets drop, interesting things happen. People commit suicide. People fall into the great abyss of despair. People do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And I started getting consultations from, believe it or not, financial institutions who said, help us deal with our clients who are doing irrational things. And if you're familiar, of course, with Kahneman's Nobel Prize winning work on cognitive processes, he says, under stress, people revert to impulsive decision-making, reflexive, gut level. And subsequent research has said that gut level decision-making is wrong roughly 70% of the time. So they were asking for guidance on such things. The rest of the pictures, there's, of course, Hurricane Katrina. There's Hurricane Irma. If you look to the left, second picture down, that's the old Metropole Hotel. That is where SARS started in Hong Kong. And it just so happened I chaired a hospital committee in Hong Kong and was on the faculty of the University of Hong Kong as an adjunct. So I was recruited to provide some consultations for that. And you look around some other pictures to certainly see 9/11. You'll see to the right of 9/11 an Iraqi tank from the country of Kuwait, where I spent some time building a resiliency clinic. So we look at these things and we say, you step back and you say, what does a disaster psychiatrist do? And the answer is all of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about psychological first aid. Again, in the spirit of full disclosure and transparency, I will tell you a little bit where that came from. In the early 90s, I was recruited by the FBI. They, in the late 1970s, early 80s, had formulated a unit called the Behavioral Science Unit. It later became quite famous because of their study of serial killers. In another part of my career, I had the good fortune to have as a mentor Theodore Milan, who I consider the greatest personologist of the last century. He also has developed the second most widely used psychological test in the world called the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory. So I studied personality with him for years, and his personality theory was the most efficient and effective way of understanding personality I had ever seen. So I was originally intrigued with the psychology of the serial killer. But two FBI agents came to me And they said, look, most of our division is going down the serial killer route, predicting criminal behavior and the like, and that's really good.